In December 1941, during World War II, the British Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, traveled to Ottawa and delivered an impassioned speech on behalf of his people to rally for the continued support for his country at war. It was a defining moment of history and one that must never be forgotten. We have here in the chamber today Ukrainian-Canadian world veteran from the Second World War who fought the Ukrainian independence against the Russians and continues to support the troops today, even at his age of 98.
This is Plausibly Live.
I had this idea for how to start the show today, which was with a joke, because it's kind of what they teach you in a little bit of public speaking. It's one way to start something, is to tell a joke, loosen things up a little bit. But the problem with what I wanted to joke about is that it's not funny. The joke that I wanted to use was, what's the difference between a politician and a statesman? And the more I tried to find humor in that situation, the more I tried to find a good punchline for that, the harder it got, because while the punchlines I was coming up with were true, they weren't making me laugh. They were pissing me off. It's a joke that we don't have statesmen today. What we have are politicians. But at the same time, it's not a joke. It's frustrating. There's a headline that broke literally moments before I started recording this about Adam Schiff of California. Adam Schiff is a congressman. Many of you know already that he is not well regarded on the right, but he is beloved on the left. And to me, he's prototypical of a politician. And the article is about how he is, through his career, using corruption, what I call corruption, earmarks that he got for defense contractors that made him money in campaigns and power and prestige, and now he wants to convert that. He wants to have Dianne Feinstein's seat in the Senate. I think Gavin Newsom might have something to say about that before that's over, but for the moment, he's making hay on this, and he's criticizing his potential opponents for not being willing to stand up for earmarks for California. Is that the hallmark of a statesman? Or is that the hallmark of a politician? My buddy Bill this morning on his show had a discussion about Florida and how they, because of their term limits, in his opinion, they don't have any statesmen in their legislature, and because they don't have any statesmen, nobody can stand up to the governor, who, even though they like the governor, might be exerting too much power. Is the governor being a politician or a statesman? I would submit to you that he's being a politician. And of course, the big one we saw this week was our friend to the north, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of the nation of Canada. All of these politicians could be statesmen. Why aren't they? Well, when you delve into history, and again, history inculcates us with values. And those values, societally, and those behaviors, societally speaking, insulate a society and, generally speaking, will prevent it from making an ass of itself on national television, worldwide television. And when you don't have those values, when you don't have those teachings, when you don't have those things internalized, you make stupid mistakes. If you were looking at the characteristics of a statesman, not a politician, we're talking about statesmen here, you have, generally speaking, four bedrock principles, I guess, four bedrock characteristics, the first of which is a bedrock of principles. The person in question, and we use the term statesman It applies to all genders, all 67 of them. No, it doesn't, because I have principles, and there are only two genders. But it applies to both of them. A bedrock of principles means that you have a firm foundation on what you believe. One of the jokes I did come up with was this one: a politician running for office was asked about his policy on liquor. He answered, quote, "If you mean the demon drink that poisons the body, ruins the mind, destroys the family, and creates criminals, then I'm against it. But if you mean the beautiful drink used for a wedding toast, the foundation of a fun Friday night, and the biggest source of tax revenue to fund needy orphans, then I'm for it, and I won't change my mind no matter what you say." A bedrock of principles becomes important as the first characteristic of a statesman. Politician says that. The second is a moral compass. The statesman has to have some sort of guiding principle in his life, his or her life, that leads them to live their life by those moral principles, by that moral compass. And when the time comes to choose to do something that violates that moral compass, they choose not to. Or, conversely, if they do fail, they recognize that failure and they move on, and they repent, and they make retribution for it. Politicians don't do that. Thirdly, statesmen have a vision. They have an idea, a plan, a goal for what they're trying to accomplish. And those principles and those compasses cannot be violated in reaching that vision. But the most important thing, I think, is that they have an ability to build a consensus towards that vision. Using those principles and that moral compass, they have the ability to convince people to go along with them. Usually through oration, rhetoric, speaking, which politicians today, unfortunately, as you're going to see tonight on the stage, if you're listening to this on Tuesday, but if you're not, then last Tuesday, as you're going to see on that stage of the Republican debate, quote unquote, none of these people have the ability to build a consensus. In all of history, perhaps the finest example of all this is a guy by the name of Pericles, who was a Greek. Around 490 BCE, Pericles established what we would commonly call the Athenian democracy. And Pericles had all of those ideas. He had those principles, that moral compass. He certainly had a vision. And more importantly, he had the ability to build that consensus to lead all of Greece to that vision. He was honest, completely devoted to public service. It was said that no Greek ever looked him into the eye, and he was able to lie to them. He couldn't do it. It was impossible for him to lie. He loved the arts. He was an intellectual. He led by moral authority rather than by inherent political power. He could have commanded. He could have said, we're doing this because I'm the guy in charge. But he didn't. He built that consensus based on his moral authority. This is the right thing to do for the most amount of our citizens. The greatest good for the greatest number of citizens was his actual quote. And he built Athens into one of the most effective empires in history. His funeral oration, as recorded by Thucydides, which if you haven't read, maybe you should. As I was sitting here doing this morning, I thought, well, we could really break down the funeral oration, but I don't want to do that today because I got a different point I'm trying to get to. But maybe in the future we'll do that. His funeral oration is the finest example in history of building that consensus with a vision, for the vision, with honesty and morality. When you compare what he had to say in that funeral oration back then to the politicians of today, you almost see another joke. Pericles wanted to build something, and he wanted people to go with him to build that. He wanted to reach with his moral authority, his moral compass. He wanted to reach out with that principle that he had and build that consensus to reach the vision. Today, however, a politician is a person who will lay down your life for their country, or perhaps someone else's country, as the case may be. To paraphrase Lloyd Benston, I've read Pericles, I've read Thucydides, and you, Mr. Trudeau, are no Pericles. Of course, you could say that about all of them, and therein lies the problem. This week, as you know, we had an incident in Canada where Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, along with the entire Canadian Parliament, led by their Speaker, welcomed President Zelensky of Ukraine to give a speech in their Parliament, which was interrupted, I think, 12 times by standing ovations. Didn't count, but there you go. At least one of those standing ovations was for this guy on the video. His name is Hunka, Yaroslav Hunka, and as it turns out, he's a Ukrainian immigrant to Canada. He's also a World War II veteran, but, as many have pointed out, he's not just a veteran. He was, in fact, a member of the Waffen-SS, the Stoffstiefel. My German's so bad. He was a member of the SS, the worst of the worst. And yes, he was Ukrainian. Yes, he fought against Russia. But that doesn't mean that he was on the right side. He was given multiple, from what I understand, standing ovations, at least two. He was greeted in the hallway by three of the leading members of the Canadian government, both speakers of both of their houses, along with the government leader, and of course, others as well. When it came out that this had happened, that the speaker had invited a member of his district, a voter in his district who happened to be Ukrainian, to the speech, but it turns out that the guy was, well, an actual Nazi, not just a political opponent that you call a Nazi, but an actual Nazi. The speaker was horribly embarrassed. He ends up resigning, and Justin Trudeau wanders out in front of the cameras and says this.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are celebrating commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine in Russia's illegal war against it.
Now, not only is that only 47 seconds to respond to what is a huge political, at least, embarrassment, it's hardly the stuff of moral compasses, hardly the stuff of bedrock principles. Certainly didn't build any consensus, did it? We're going to continue to support Ukraine because I say so. Oh, and by the way, it's somebody else's fault. You know, it's Putin's fault. It's Russian disinformation. Russian disinformation that a Nazi soldier that you just gave a standing ovation to was a member of an SS unit that has been unconfirmed but supposed to be involved with Holocaust activities? And again, there's no argument that he was there. There's actually a great video of the speaker himself introducing Mr. Hunka to the Parliament, and you can see as he's reading his introduction, you can literally see the second that he realizes this may not be a good idea. You can see it, and if you watch it, you'll see what I'm saying. But ultimately, he took the responsibility. He invited him. He said, look, I invited him. I take the responsibility. I resign. The Prime Minister, on the other hand, the leader of Canada, the man who has an opportunity to be a statesman, to show bedrock principles, to show a moral compass, to have a vision, and to build a consensus, chooses instead to blame Russia and to dictate what the country is going to do from there. Yesterday, the Canadian Parliament actually had a motion on the floor, and I didn't follow the vote, so I don't know if they did it or not, but there was a motion on the floor of the Canadian Parliament to, quote, strike from the record the events of Zelensky's speech. In other words, we're just going to pretend that never happened. It won't be part of the public record. As if you could do that in the 21st century, as if everybody hasn't seen it already. We're just going to strike it. It never happened. We're done. We're through. We're over and done with. These are not the actions of statesmen. These are the actions of politicians who are trying to cover their butts. And as we look around the world today, you wonder, how did we get to this point? Oddly enough, this week in the Talmud, there's a discussion about King David and the story of King David and Bathsheba. And rabbis will argue about anything. You know this. Rabbis will argue about, what color the sky is, if they could. But it's an interesting discussion in the sense that they get into, well, who's actually guilty in the murder of Uriah? Is it David? Is it Joab, the leader of the army? Or is it no one? And while they spend a lot of time in this argument, while they spend a lot of time in this discussion, while they spend a lot of time picking apart the nuances, and just for the record, because I know you care, Jewish law is structured such that King David was not guilty of murder. And because there was no one to accuse him, he wasn't actually guilty of adultery under the law. You understand that? But that didn't stop Nathan, the prophet, from pointing out the fact that he had sinned against God, and his moral compass had failed. His bedrock principles had failed. His vision for leadership of the nation had failed. You can't build a consensus that way. The moral of the story, of course, and I'm not going to go through the whole Talmudic debate, is that King David repented, and he repented quite publicly. So even though there was no one to accuse him, because Uriah was dead and Bathsheba surely wasn't going to do it, David repented publicly. And the beautiful words of his Psalm in 51 are oration that most of these people could never even imagine doing. And therein lies the big difference between statesmen and politicians. Politicians have none of those four characteristics. They don't have any interest in any of that stuff. They don't have any interest in consensus building. They don't have any interest in a vision. Their only vision is to stay in office. The only morality they're guided by, the only moral compass they use, is the one that says what's best for me. And they certainly do not have any bedrock principles. They stick their finger in the air. Which way is the wind blowing? And that's the direction I will go. Now, we could be really angry over Trudeau's error. We could be very angry about his blaming everyone else but himself, and taking no accountability for it, and in fact, instead using political authority to redirect the conversation. Oh, this is Russia's fault, and we will continue to support Ukraine. We could be mad about that. But I think what we should really be is sad. We should be sad that he, Justin Trudeau, is such a small person. He's such a failure as a statesman. Oh, he's a politician, all right. But he's nothing more than that. We should be sad that he leads his nation not from moral authority, but from his inherent political power. He got power politically, and that's what drives what he does. He doesn't build consensus. He only issues commandments. And in 45 seconds, you can hear that in his own voice. We should be sad that it applies here in the United States, too. show me the leader here that's actually a statesman. Show me the leader here that has those four characteristics all the time, constantly, consistently. There isn't any. And we should be sad about that. We should be concerned. We should be looking around our nation when we say, who's going to lead us next, instead of these 6 or 7 politicians that'll be on the stage tonight. We should instead be we shouldn't be looking to them. We should be looking for that next Pericles. Who is that Pericles today? Who is that statesman today that has those bedrock principles, that has a moral compass, that has a vision for what we should be doing? And most importantly, who can build a consensus rather than simply use political power to command us.